Even though Mark Twain began writing Adventures of Huckleberry Finn shortly after the successful publication and sales of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in 1876, he did not complete the new manuscript until nearly 8 years later. This fact alone would not be very important in our consideration of the novel were it not for one interesting detail. When the action of the story reached the point when Huck and Jim lose their way in the fog as they drift down the Mississippi River, Mark Twain has them miss a crucial turn in their navigation. It was at this point that Twain stopped writing. Having traveled under cover on a raft for miles headed south, the two reached the river town of Cairo in southern Illinois, where the Mississippi River meets the Ohio River. The density of the fog causes Huck and Jim to continue past Cairo, headed due south on the Mississippi, which is almost certainly not part of their intended plan. It's an important disruption because the Ohio River flows to the east and north, to the state of Ohio, for which it is named. In the decades immediately preceding the Civil War, in those very years in which the novel's action is set, the Ohio River was the most important conduit of escape to freedom for renegade slaves like Jim. Part of the importance lay in the fact that Ohio was a so-called free state that did not have the institution of slavery, and once an escaped slave reached that state, the Underground Railroad of safe houses and secret routes provided a sanctuary and a chance even to reach the Canadian border. By 1850, the enormous disorder surrounding slave states and free states, legal jurisdictions and sanctuaries, property rights and moral resistance to the idea of people as property culminated in a new and controversial federal law known as the Fugitive Slave Act. Every American citizen, whether living in a state where slavery was legal or in a free state like Ohio and the New England states, among others, was compelled to capture and return any escaped slaves to their owners, no matter how far they had traveled. We're told the events of Twain's novel take place in the 1830s or early 1840s, so while this is well before the 1850 law passed, Jim's experiences convey the precarious situation he faces. He's under constant danger of being captured. He has a ransom on his head. He's liable more to be lynched than safely returned to Miss Watson, or, more likely still, be captured and resold to an entirely different master for a high bounty. We should remember, too, that Jim, as a fictional character, as a representation of an American slave, was conceived by Twain more than 25 years after the fugitive slave law came into effect. Twain would obviously be aware of the consequences of that law and of the way it so brutally divided the country leading up to the Civil War. This retrospective shading of the past with a present consciousness makes Mark Twain's depiction of Jim's dangerous flight to freedom all the more urgent and controversial. There's something else, too. Among the many markets for the selling of human slaves in the southern states, the largest of them was situated at the mouth of the Mississippi River, where it drained into the Gulf of Mexico. This was, of course, in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. The largest commodity sold there was human laborers to work in the fields of large tobacco, cotton, or sugarcane plantations throughout the Deep South. These were the primary agricultural industries driving the economy and supplying goods throughout the country and indeed to other parts of the world. The work was grueling, relentless, brutal. Abuse of slaves was rampant. There were degrees of violence and living conditions for slaves that varied from region to region, state to state. In some farming communities, for example, in the state of Kentucky, slaves did not work the fields to the degree that they did in the South. A very good literary picture of how differently slaves were treated can be seen in Harriet Beecher Stowe's enormously popular novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written about 30 years earlier than Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We first meet the character Tom, the slave of the title, in Kentucky, where, although he's not a free man, he is treated affectionately and is well cared for before his master has to sell him to pay off his debts. Uncle Tom's subsequent owners take him farther and farther south, until he's finally sent to work the plantation of a warped, violent owner named Simon Legree. The reason Jim runs away from his owner, Miss Watson, in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is because he overhears her contemplating selling him down the river, which is a colloquialism for sending her property to New Orleans for sale on the slave market. The terrifying reputation of the New Orleans slave market spread so widely and had accumulated such dismal associations that even Jim, an illiterate slave living hundreds of miles away, knows about it and has a nightmare about witches flying him to that location. Now we can understand what it meant for Twain to send both Huck and Jim, his literary characters, in the wrong direction, headed south to New Orleans. Having missed their opportunity to get Jim to a free state, the two of them drift continually southward, and as they do so, their adventures take on a more urgent, more anxious, and ominous tone. It is this development in Mark Twain's latest boys' story that suddenly stymies his writing, but it's also what eventually turned this boys' story into a fully mature, compelling, and richly complex American novel. I think by the time Mark Twain reached this impasse in writing the manuscript of his novel, he realized that the river journey of Huck and the fugitive slave Jim could not so easily lend itself to the kinds of books and stories he had written up to that time in his career. His halting progress, which lasted several years, indicates a creative challenge, a reassessment of his literary goals, and a working through of certain social and moral questions that would come to preoccupy him about American society for the remainder of his professional life. Remember also that as the years between 1876 and 1885 went by, Mark Twain had witnessed firsthand the consequences of emancipation, the defeat of the Southern Confederacy, and the disastrous failure of the program of Reconstruction. So, even though the events of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn take place before the Civil War, its aftermath is very present in some of the novel's satire and themes. All of this is to say that Mark Twain was thinking about and composing his book during a time in which his own troubled ideas and preoccupations about slavery and race in America were evolving in complex ways. Remember, his father had been a slave owner, and as a Southern boy, Sam Clemens would have lived in very close proximity to black folks. We also need to understand that Mark Twain was an eyewitness to a country that was undergoing a vast transformation. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, the federal policy of Reconstruction fell under the executive control of Lincoln's successor, Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was an obstructionist and a self-avowed racist, whose unwillingness to support the policies Lincoln had begun to put in place led to his impeachment. Although never convicted by the Senate, the damage his administration caused for the hope of civil rights for freed black slaves had already done its work. Essentially, Johnson had reasserted the same racist ideology that had fueled the Civil War and the era of slavery preceding it. When you add to this the passage 20 years later of the landmark Supreme Court decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, with its infamous ruling of separate but equal provisions regarding race relations, you begin to get a sense of the disillusionment with government's ability to uphold the Constitution's guarantee of individual freedoms and rights. The separate but equal ruling was put into practice in the southern states, legitimizing segregation throughout the social world with an array of what are called Jim Crow laws. So this complicated legal, social, and cultural legacy finds its way into Mark Twain's biting satire and often his despairing attitude towards humanity in its so-called social or civilized form. It affected the manner in which he attempted to follow up his wildly popular boys' book with a sequel featuring essentially a dirt-poor white boy who finds himself enslaved by a violent father and chained to social and personal circumstances that he alternately evades and succumbs to. In his lonesomeness and subjugation, his only true friend is a black slave whose escape Huck both abets and struggles over. Every human or social entanglement from which Huck extricates himself in the first dozen chapters of the novel, for instance from Tom Sawyer, from the widow Douglas, from his father Pap, from the Duke and the King eventually, leads him into further social isolation. Huckleberry Finn is arguably one of those archetypal American literary characters like James Fenimore Cooper's Pioneer, Natty Bumppo in the Leatherstocking Tales, or Herman Melville's Ishmael, and even Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's Jay Gatsby, or Ernest Hemingway's Nick Adams, who are all profoundly singular and almost existentially estranged from their societies. In Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the lonesomeness of the central character is temporarily relieved only by the slowly developing intimacy he has with perhaps the most isolated, most socially bereft individual in the whole book, if not in the whole country, an enslaved man without rights named Jim. So Huckleberry Finn was not the book Mark Twain set out to write in 1876, and the one he finally did complete in 1885 is still haunted by an ambivalence about the human and social status of black slaves. So what did Twain write, and why do we read the novel so differently today compared to the way Twain's readers may have experienced the book? Why does the book lend itself to such multiple interpretations? And can we locate one that seems closest to the real nature of its artistry? Well, to answer those questions, we need a little bit more historical perspective. In particular, we have to look back at how different Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is from its predecessor, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That book begins with the following preface by Mark Twain. Although my book is intended mainly for entertainment of boys and girls, I hope it will not be shunned by men and women on that account, for part of my plan has been to try to pleasantly remind adults of what they once were themselves, and how they felt and thought and talked, and what queer enterprises they sometimes engaged in. In the first half of the 20th century, Adventures of Tom Sawyer was Mark Twain's best-selling book, one of about 20 bestsellers in the history of United States publishing. But after the Second World War, readers of Mark Twain began to find Adventures of Huckleberry Finn more compelling, more nuanced, more brilliant in many of its parts, if not its whole. In the second half of the 20th century, it surpassed Tom Sawyer to become what the literary critic Jonathan Arick has called a hyper-canonized literary text. When Mark Twain designed an advertising campaign for the new book, he placed notices in various newspapers that began by telling readers that the popularity of his previous book indicated in an unmistakable way that the public desired another work in the same vein by its author. But the books, of course, are very different. The vein Mark Twain was referring to was the so-called Bad Boys book, of which there were hundreds, being made available to young readers throughout the decades leading up to the Civil War. We might call this now juvenile literature, which is not to be confused with the thriving market of young adult fiction that we're familiar with today. Those kinds of books, as you know, often deal with pretty serious social issues. What we're talking about is light, entertaining, funny reading material, a prime example of which was a series of books featuring a naughty boy character that came to be known as Peck's Bad Boy. This was a character created by a writer named Thomas Bailey Aldrich, and it is this author's work that William Dean Howells most associated with Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Unlike a lot of the reviews of Tom Sawyer, Howells' review of that book noted an interesting difference in the quality of Twain's book that he did not find in Aldrich's work. The review goes this way: Mr. Aldrich has studied the life of a bad boy as the pleasant reprobate led it in a quiet New England town 25 or 30 years ago, where, in spite of the natural outlawry of boyhood, he was more or less part of a settled order of things. He was hemmed in, to some measure, by the traditions of an established civilization. Mr. Clemens, on the contrary, has taken a boy of the Southwest for the hero of his new book, and has presented him with a fidelity to circumstance which loses no charm by being realistic in the highest degree, and which gives incomparably the best picture of life in that region as yet known to fiction. Howells goes on to write, "The story is a wonderful study of the boy mind, which inhabits a world quite distinct from that in which he is bodily present with his elders, and in this lies its great charm and its universality, for boy nature, however human nature varies, is the same everywhere." The differences Howells notices then include the following. First, previous boys' books, like those written by Aldrich, were, quote, more or less part of a settled order of things, and hemmed in, to some measure, by the traditions of an established civilization, end quote. Howells was also struck by the fact that this character came from the southwestern region of the country, far away from the older, more established cultural hub of the country that New England represented. And that culture included, incidentally, the literary tradition associated with New England writers who were, by and large, university-trained men like the classical scholar and poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, Charles Eliot Norton, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and other well-known men of letters. In a small new country, this was a flowering of culture and civilization that was for the most part homegrown, but whose literary inspirations and models, with the exception perhaps of Emerson, came largely from European traditions rather than from the realities and heterogeneous rural communities of America itself. As an editor of a prestigious East Coast magazine, William Dean Howells, himself a transplanted Midwesterner, was always on the lookout for examples of local realism coming from writers who lived and knew about these rather strange, almost exotic-seeming pockets of American life. His instincts extended to including women writers from different regions, African-American writers like Charles W. Chestnut, Jewish-American writers like Abraham Cahan, city journalists like Stephen Crane, and new writers who were influenced by the realist and naturalist literary schools represented by the great French novelists like Honoré de Balzac, Émile Zola, Gustave Flaubert, and Guy de Maupassant. Howells was himself largely self-taught, and once he had made his way into Boston's literary establishment, began to sense the waning energy of elite, learned writers and the imitative work they were producing. I'll have more to say about Mark Twain's campaign against this so-called genteel tradition because it's important for understanding the nature of his literary achievement. But for now, I want to return to another point Howells notices about the adventures of Tom Sawyer. Howells praises the way Mark Twain is able to represent what he calls the boy mind that inhabits a world quite distinct from that in which he is bodily present with his elders. Remember, though, that Tom Sawyer is a book narrated by a third-person narrator, which means that even though the achievement of representing the difference between the childhood world and the adult world is remarkable, it is still mediated by the choice of the novel's narrative structure. While the point of view may be said to belong squarely with Tom, the narrative is not his to voice. In Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, on the contrary, it's Huck, of course, who speaks to the reader, and only Huck. The point of view, or the take on the events that happen in the novel, are his, and so is the manner of conveying that view or those opinions as well. The boy mind is revealed even more directly or nakedly than it is in Tom Sawyer, and is further complicated by the way that mind struggles with what it is being taught of what is right or what is wrong. In other words, this isn't just a picture of a boy, but a picture of youth itself, of innocence mixed with skepticism, a mind that takes things quite literally and pragmatically, eschewing nuance and lies and treachery from the adult world. In a sense, Mark Twain invests the boy mind with a closeness to nature, and the adult world with the corruption of civilization. This is not so much a humorous contest between a carefree child and a scolding adult, but a more symbolic, deeper struggle between nature and civilization, individualism and sociality. With this in mind, let's return to the way in which Mark Twain himself characterized his new book, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You'll notice in this advertisement a combination of self-promotion and some insights that might surprise you. Interwoven in its text are side-splitting stories, sly hits at different weaknesses of society, and adventures of the most humorous description. All of its 43 chapters are simply overflowing with interest and humor. In the abstract, the book is the story of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and a Negro named Jim, who, in their travels, fall in with two tramps engaged in taking in the different country towns through which they pass, by means of the missionary dodge, the temperance crusade, or under any pretext that offers to easily raise a dishonest dollar. The writer follows these characters through their various adventures until finally we find the tramps properly and warmly clothed, with a coat of tar and feathers, and the boys and Jim escape their persecutions and return safely to their friends. As a kind of summary of this novel, we have to ask ourselves what's emphasized here and what's left out. If, for instance, you were to take the ad at face value, would it really describe the book that you're reading? Notice that Jim, for instance, is described only as a Negro, not as a slave or an escaping slave, the way we refer to him these days. The relationship between Huck and Jim, which occupies more than half the novel, is de-emphasized in favor of stressing the friendship of Huck, Tom, and Jim, even though Tom Sawyer appears only briefly at the beginning of the novel and a little more prominently at the end. And finally, the conclusion of the novel is described as featuring the Duke and the King getting their comeuppance by the townsfolk that they've been swindling, which frees Huck, Tom, and Jim to rejoin their friends. But that's not really how the book ends. In fact, it tends to drag on with a kind of playful reenactment of Jim's enslavement, an elaborate game cooked up by Tom Sawyer, even though the boy knows that Miss Watson has already set him free. And perhaps most interestingly of all, Huck does not rejoin his friends for a very long time, but decides in the famous last line of the novel to, quote, light out for the territory, unquote, or move farther west alone. In asserting this desire or need to flee the confines and complexities of American civilization, Huckleberry Finn literally ejects himself from his own story. How did the novel's first readers understand what they were reading? Did their experience match Mark Twain's own expectations as voiced in his ad? One critic put it this way: but though Huckleberry Finn, compared to Tom Sawyer, may not quite reach the highest points of that previous book, we incline to the opinion that the general level of the later story is perhaps higher than that of the earlier. For one thing, the skill with which the character of Huck Finn is maintained is marvelous. We see everything through his eyes. They are his eyes, and not a pair of Mark Twain's spectacles. So the takeaway here is that even in these early reviews, differences in the literary quality of the two books are being noticed. And in this case, the observation that Huck is narrating the story is a distinguishing feature. Mark Twain is a literary artist of a very high order, and one of the most artistic things in Huckleberry Finn is the sober self-restraint with which Mr. Clemens lets Huck Finn set down, without any comment at all, scenes which would have afforded the ordinary writer matter for endless moral and political and sociological disquisition. This same review begins to notice something else important to our discussion: the contrast between Tom Sawyer, who is the child of respectable parents, decently brought up, and Huckleberry Finn, who is the child of the town drunkard, not brought up at all, is made distinct by 100 artistic touches, not the least of which is Huck's constant reference to Tom as his ideal of what a boy should be. This is a distinction Mark Twain's advertisement does not bother to make, but it's actually central to the book, for reasons we'll soon see. And finally, from another review, we come very close to an aspect of the novel that has had the most significance for today's readers. It is proper to say that Mr. Clemens strikes in a very amusing way certain psychological problems. What, for instance, in the case of Huck, the son of the town drunkard, perverted from the time of his birth, is conscience, and how does it work? Most amusing is the struggle Huck has with his conscience in regard to slavery. The whole study of Huck's moral nature is as serious as it is amusing. His confusion of wrong as right and his abnormal mendacity traceable to his training from infancy is a singular contribution to the investigation of human nature. What I think we can conclude here is an ambiguity between what the text Mark Twain was selling to the readers of his day is about, and what we have come to understand about the novel. And that's because the ambiguities are interwoven in the text itself. Already some of the early book reviews hint at this double reading, and I think this is both an effect of Mark Twain delivering a Mark Twain product. At the same time, Samuel Clemens, the writer, is dramatically expanding the literary and artistic possibilities that he can invest into a routine and popular form of storytelling. One obvious sign of that leap in artistic development is the long gap in completing the novel that he began to write. We can glean from these early reviews 3 areas of inquiry that warrant further thought. The first one is the invention of Huck's first-person narration, or what we might call his voice, and the artistic control that Mark Twain is able to maintain over his unique point of view. The second has to do with the way Mark Twain crafts the relationship between Huck Finn and his friend Tom Sawyer. The focus here is on class differences, of course, but also differences in moral values. This issue naturally leads into another related topic having to do with the origins of Huck's conscience and how it is that his disadvantages, his lack of education, have not compromised his shrewd ability to notice the difference between what's true and what's false, what's hypocritical and what is sincere, or the difference between human depravity and human compassion. And thirdly, what are the layers of meaning in the text? If, as one critic notes, there is a manifestly comic element to the novel, as well as a more serious, latent element, how do these 2 levels work together, and to what end do they work? When Huck first introduces himself to the reader, he does so by associating himself with a better-known character, Tom Sawyer. And what you notice is that it's not the actual person that Huck is referring to, but a book in which the both of them appear. The connection between the boys is therefore a literary connection, what you might also call a textual relationship. And this makes sense on a purely practical level of advertising. For those who may have never read Mark Twain's previous books, this opening line tells them where to go or what to read for the prequel to the story they are about to read. And for those enamored of the former book, Adventures of Tom Sawyer, this new book establishes its qualities and raises expectations about the reading experience to come. You'll also note that the opening of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has some older business to take care of, given its status as a sequel. We learn, for example, that Tom and Huck have found a small fortune in a cave where robbers have hidden it, and that each boy is worth $6,000 apiece, all gold. Just in terms of monetary worth, then, these boys, who are in other ways very different in class rank, family, security, education, and manners, are exactly equal in value. Again, the underlying implication is that as literary characters go, lower types like Huck have just as much interest for readers than conventional polite characters like Tom, and they can lend themselves to an author's artistic treatment in all the ways that are more acceptable for readers. You can't help but notice the way Huck speaks. His use of language is informal, to say the least. He speaks a particular regional dialect many, if not most, readers would not have heard before or seen in print. To see that way of speaking transcribed onto the page highlights how ungrammatical it is, how many words are misspelled, how many unusual contractions there are, and how many cuss words are used. Librarians in Cambridge, Massachusetts, once took the book off their shelves, forbidding people, especially young people, from reading such blasphemous trash. And it isn't as if these degenerate utterances appeared just occasionally in scraps of dialogue carefully embedded in standard written English. It was the entire self-enclosed text produced out of one continuous voice, one view of the world given by an illiterate white trash boy from somewhere in the South. Tom Sawyer, the boy, and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the book, occupy a very different status with regard to the perceived civility of standardized written English. The nameless third-person narrator of that book controls what the reader sees, what the reader knows, and how the reader comes to know the characters. The way that narrator speaks has a reassuring, educated, trustworthy sound to it, conferring a kind of legitimacy onto the very language. In a sense, you could correlate this more correct way of speaking and writing with those who occupy the dominant center of the culture, not its margins. Consequently, deviations from the official language of middle-class American life and the correctness of literary language are seen as having lesser value, less beauty and intelligence, less authority to convey universal truths. The compelling structural element of the narrative and adventures of Huckleberry Finn is that while its central character comes filtered through the receding presence of Tom Sawyer, its powers expand to such a degree that the marginal very soon becomes the dominant center for the time it takes to read the novel. Then, in the last 10 chapters or so, Tom Sawyer physically returns to the text, bracketing, as it were, and shutting down again the marginality of Huck Finn that had been unloosed in so many different sounds, images, and most importantly of all, ways of thinking. In addition to the way the narrative structure, or I should say the authorial framing of the novel, keeps us aware of Huck's marginality, so too does his relationship with Tom Sawyer. Tom is more fully integrated into the community where they live. Tom is literate and is fond of reading a certain kind of romantic fiction that features things like brave knights and genies and castles. In fact, these books are a kind of law to him, offering ways of modeling his behavior, no matter how absurd or impractical that may be. In a real sense, he confuses fiction with real life, while the fiction Mark Twain is writing aspires to turn real life into fiction. Tom is rule-bound, obeying texts written by other people. He also obeys certain rules of economy, leaving money behind, for instance, for the candles that he and Huck take. Literary characters are, as we know, representations of people, and writers work very hard to individualize these characters, to make them appear fully human and very specific. This is certainly the case with Mark Twain's characters, but Huck, for example, gives frequent expression to his loneliness, which increasingly seems to take on the status of a permanent condition or a thematic concern as the novel nears its conclusion. Note the following passage, for instance. "Then I sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think of something cheerful, but it warn't no use. I felt so lonesome, I most wished I was dead. The stars was shining, and the leaves rustled in the woods ever so mournful, and I heard an owl away off, hooing about somebody that was dead, and a whippoorwill and a dog crying about somebody that was going to die, and the wind was trying to whisper something to me, and I couldn't make out what it was, and so it made the cold shivers run over me. Then, away out in the woods, I heard that kind of a sound that a ghost makes when it wants to tell about something that's on its mind and can't make itself understood, and so can't rest easy in its grave and has to go about that way every night grieving. I got so downhearted and scared, I did wish I had some company. This lonesomeness comes back occasionally in the book, and it's like a reminder of Huck's precarious social situation and his orphan status. The paradox is that while his isolation begins to seem inherent to his character, it also fuels his desire to connect with other people, to have company, as Huck puts it here. The problem, of course, is that these sought-after social and human connections tend to be unsatisfying or curb his freedom and natural inclinations. In some cases, as with Pap, they are even life-threatening. But it is the desire to overcome lonesomeness that draws Huck to someone like Jim, and vice versa, and that unlikely alliance is mutually nurturing, taking on as it does the simulation of a father-son relationship, or friendship, or interracial love, as the critic Leslie Fiedler long ago suggested in an essay called Come Back to the Raft, Huck Honey. The darker tone in the passage I just read comes from its obsession with death, and I can't help thinking about this heavy emphasis on death in relation to what happens to Huck a few chapters later when he fakes his own death. You'll remember that he's being held captive in Pap's cabin, and having managed to escape from the father who wants his money, he makes it look like Pap has murdered him. Later on, he hides behind the bushes along the riverbank, watching a boat full of the townsfolk looking for his dead body. In a sense, this is a very vivid image of the book's narrative inventiveness and structural brilliance. Huck sees every member of society floating by him, but they cannot see him. Huck's vantage point, or what we can call his point of view, puts some distance between him and the object of his gaze and his thoughts. It's the ideal position for overhearing what people are saying and doing, especially what they're saying about Huck. The reader, moreover, assumes this same point of view along with Huck, seeing everything through his eyes. And yet the death imagery is haunting in a way. To be so marginal, so invisible to society, is a kind of death. The historian Orlando Patterson, in writing about the institution of American slavery and its pervasive, insidious legacy, coined the term social death to describe just this phenomenon. Returning to the passage that I read once more, something else occurs to me. The sound and the word of the owl's cry. Who, who. Part of what it means to feel invisible, lonely, undervalued, is to question who one is. If the owl's cry is a projection of Huck's question, who, it is finally answered in that scene by a response. Pretty soon I heard a twig snap, says Huck a little later. I sat still and listened. Directly, I could just barely hear a meow down there. That was good, says I. Meow, as soft as I could. And sure enough, there was Tom Sawyer waiting for me. For every me, it would seem, there is a you. And together, Huck and Tom become not just reunited as friends, but become two sides of one being.